The crystal tumbler in my hand caught the soft, amber light of the cabin, casting fractured reflections across the polished mahogany table. Inside the glass, 2 cubes of ice clinked gently against the sides, floating in a measure of 20-year-old scotch. It was the sound of victory. It was the sound of arriving. To the skyline, David said, raising his own glass. His voice, usually a quiet, measured baritone that commanded the attention of every boardroom he entered, held a rare tremor of unfiltered joy. To the skyline, Sarah and Marcus echoed in unison. I raised my glass to meet theirs, the 4 rims ringing out a delicate chime that felt like the punctuation mark on the last 5 years of our lives. To leaving a mark, I added, taking a slow sip. The liquor burned a warm, satisfying trail down my throat. We were cruising at 40,000 feet in a chartered Gulfstream G650, moving at nearly the speed of sound, yet the cabin felt as still and secure as a high-end lounge in Manhattan. The air smelled of expensive leather, ozone, and the faint, citrusy notes of Sarah's perfume. Spread out on the table between us were the blueprints and 3D renderings of the Ether Spire, a revolutionary, sustainable skyscraper that we had just successfully pitched to the most ruthless development syndicate in Chicago. We had won. At 34, I was the lead architect, but it was David, my mentor and the founder of the firm, who had guided my erratic brilliance into something tangible. Sarah, our structural engineer, had made sure my wild designs wouldn't collapse, and Marcus, our charismatic project manager, had sold the dream to the suits. We weren't just colleagues, we were a beautifully calibrated machine. We were family. I turned my head to look out the thick, oval window. Below us, the Canadian Rockies stretched out like the spine of a sleeping white dragon. Jagged peaks, smothered in ancient ice and snow, pierced through a thin, translucent layer of cirrus clouds. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western horizon in bruised shades of violet and burnt orange. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and entirely indifferent to us. Up here, wrapped in a pressurized cocoon of steel, composites, and heated air, the brutal reality of the wilderness below felt like nothing more than a high-definition movie playing on a silent screen. "You're quiet, Elias," David noted, leaning back into his plush leather seat. The reading light illuminated the silver at his temples and the deep laugh lines around his eyes. "Thinking about the next project already? Take a breath, son. Let yourself enjoy the summit before you look for the next mountain." "Just taking it in, David," I smiled, gesturing to the window. "It's hard to believe we actually pulled it off. They tore us apart in the first half of the meeting." Marcus laughed, a booming, infectious sound. He loosened his silk tie and unbuttoned his collar. "They were just testing our resolve, man. When Sarah threw those stress test analytics on the screen, I swear the CEO's jaw hit the mahogany. It was poetry." Sarah offered a modest, but fiercely proud, smirk. She was meticulously organizing her tablet, ever the perfectionist. "Numbers don't lie, Marcus. But Elias's aesthetic vision is what made them open their wallets. It's a good balance." Just then, a faint tremor vibrated through the floorboards. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shudder, like driving over a small pothole. The liquid in my glass trembled. Ding! The seat belt sign illuminated above our heads with a soft chime. A second later, the intercom crackled to life. Captain Miller's voice was smooth, carrying the manufactured calm inherent to all seasoned pilots. "Good evening, folks. This is the flight deck. We're tracking a rather unseasonal weather front moving in over the peaks ahead. We're going to experience some moderate chop for the next 20 minutes or so as we climb to find some smoother air. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts securely. Flight attendant, please prepare the cabin." "Well, so much for the victory lap," Marcus sighed, placing his half-empty glass into the secure cup holder and clicking his belt into place. I did the same, pulling the strap tight across my waist. I wasn't an anxious flyer, but there is always a primal, microscopic sliver of unease when the artificial ground beneath your feet begins to move. The turbulence escalated quickly. It didn't build, it arrived. Within 3 minutes, the moderate chop Captain Miller had promised turned into violent, jarring slams. The Gulf Stream, usually a paragon of aerodynamic grace, began to buck like a wild animal. The sky outside the window had transformed rapidly. The bruised violet sunset was swallowed whole by an encroaching wall of charcoal black cumulonimbus clouds. We were flying directly into the belly of a monster. The cabin lights flickered. The soft hum of the twin Rolls-Royce engines took on a strained, whining pitch as they fought against massive downdrafts. "Jesus," Sarah gasped as a sudden drop left us weightless for a terrifying second. Her tablet slipped from her grasp, clattering sharply against the opposite bulkhead. She reached for it, but the plane violently yawed to the left, pinning her back against her seat. "Leave it, Sarah," David commanded, his voice losing its relaxed warmth, replaced by sharp authority. "Keep your belt tight." I gripped the armrests, my knuckles turning white. The leather, once comforting, now felt slick with the sudden sweat on my palms. The noise inside the cabin was deafening, a cacophony of groaning metal, rattling overhead bins, and the relentless, screaming howl of the wind outside tearing at the fuselage. "We are in a metal tube, 40,000 feet in the air," a treacherous voice whispered in my mind. "We do not belong up here." Then, the world exploded in white. A blinding flash of lightning, so bright it burned an afterimage into my retinas, struck the right wing. It wasn't just a flash, it was a physical blow. The concussive boom that followed was louder than any artillery fire, vibrating through my teeth and rattling my bones. Instantly, the pitch of the right engine changed. The steady, powerful roar devolved into a sickening, metallic grinding sound, followed by a series of explosive backfires. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Center, this is Gulfstream N741 Alpha. We have suffered a catastrophic strike to Engine 2. Engine 2 is failing." Captain Miller's voice bled through the intercom, no longer smooth. It was tight, rapid, and laced with controlled panic. It wasn't meant for us, he had keyed the PA system by mistake in the chaos. Hearing the pilot say Mayday is the moment the illusion of safety shatters completely. The plane banked violently to the right, the loss of thrust on that side dragging us into an unnatural, stomach-churning tilt. Alarms began to blare from the cockpit, high-pitched, electronic screams that pierced the noise of the storm. Then came the depressurization. There was a loud pop, like a balloon bursting directly next to my ear, followed by a rushing, tearing sound as the pressurized air inside the cabin was sucked out into the freezing void of the storm. The temperature plummeted instantly. A thick, white fog of condensation filled the cabin, obscuring my view of Marcus and Sarah. Yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling panels, dancing wildly on their clear plastic tethers. "Put them on! Put them on!" David yelled over the roaring wind. I could barely see him through the fog. I grabbed the yellow cup, my hands shaking so violently I fumbled the elastic strap twice before getting it over my head. I pulled the lanyard to start the oxygen flow, pressing the cold plastic to my face. I looked over at David. He had his mask on, his eyes wide, fixed on mine. The plane was no longer flying, it was falling. We were caught in a death spiral, diving at an impossible angle. The G-forces pressed me brutally into my seat, a crushing weight on my chest that made it impossible to breathe, even with the oxygen flowing. The blood rushed to my feet, and my vision began to narrow, tunneling into gray at the edges. Through the fog and the chaos, I heard Sarah screaming. It wasn't a scream of words, it was a raw, primal sound of absolute terror that will echo in my nightmares until the day I die. Marcus was silent, his hands gripping the armrests so hard his fingers looked broken. I turned my head, fighting the immense gravitational pressure, to look at David one last time. My mentor. The man who had shaped my life. He wasn't looking out the window. He wasn't looking at the falling masks. He was looking directly at me. Beneath the plastic of his oxygen mask, his lips moved. I couldn't hear him over the catastrophic roar of the dying aircraft, but I didn't need to. The look in his eyes, a heartbreaking mixture of sorrow, fear, and a final, desperate apology, said everything. The sky outside the window was a blur of violent gray and black. We broke through the bottom of the cloud layer, and suddenly, the earth was there. It wasn't a distant abstract painting anymore. The jagged, merciless peaks of the Rockies were rushing up to meet us at hundreds of miles an hour. Pine trees looked like tiny, dark needles, growing larger by the millisecond. This is it, my mind processed with terrifying clarity. This is how it ends. I closed my eyes. I didn't pray. I just braced for the end of the world. The impact was not a sound. It was an apocalyptic transfer of kinetic energy. The fuselage hit the timberline, and the universe dissolved into a symphony of screaming, tearing metal, shattering glass, and the violent fracturing of reality itself. I was thrown forward against my harness with force that felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. And then, the roaring stopped. The screaming stopped. The terror stopped. There was only a blinding flash of pain, followed by a crushing, suffocating darkness, and a gravity of silence so profound it felt like death. Consciousness did not return all at once. It seeped back in agonizingly slow increments, like freezing water rising in a dark well. The first thing I registered was the smell. It was a noxious, heavy cocktail of raw aviation fuel, scorched synthetic leather, pulverized pine resin, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of copper. Blood. My blood. The second sensation was a biting, aggressive cold that seemed to bypass my skin and sink directly into my marrow. I opened my eyes, but the world was violently wrong. The dim, gray light of the storm filtered through shattered polycarbonate windows, revealing a space that defied gravity. I was hanging upside down. The heavy, reinforced buckle of my 5-point harness was digging into my abdomen, suspending my entire body weight. Below me, which used to be the ceiling of the cabin, was a chaotic tapestry of torn insulation, dangling oxygen masks, and exposed, sparking wiring. I tried to draw a breath, but my ribs protested with a sharp, stabbing agony. I gasped, choking on the freezing, fuel-heavy air. As my mind struggled to clear the concussive fog, a localized epicenter of pain began to throb in my left arm. I looked up down at it. It was pinned at an unnatural, sickening angle against the crushed side of the fuselage. The sleeve of my bespoke charcoal suit was torn, soaked in a spreading crimson stain. Panic, raw and unadulterated, flared in my chest. I thrashed against the harness, a primal instinct to escape, but the movement sent a shockwave of white-hot agony through my arm that nearly made me black out again. Breathe, I commanded myself. Think. I reached up with my functioning right hand, gripping the overhead bin now below me to support my weight. With a trembling thumb, I pressed the heavy release button on the buckle. It jammed for a terrifying second before giving way with a loud clack. I fell, crashing hard against the debris-littered ceiling. I couldn't stop the scream that tore from my throat as my left arm took the brunt of the impact. For several minutes, I lay there among the shattered overhead lights and scattered blueprints, panting, eyes squeezed shut as waves of nausea washed over me. The silence of the mountains was profound, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind rushing through a massive, jagged tear in the fuselage just a few feet away. Where was the roaring of the engines? Where were the alarms? David. My voice was a raspy, weak croak. It sounded alien in the immense quiet. Sarah? Marcus? Nothing. I forced myself up, rolling onto my right side and using my good arm to push myself into a kneeling position. I cradled my shattered left arm against my chest. The cabin was a slaughterhouse of twisted metal and crushed luxury. The impact had sheared the plane entirely in half just ahead of the wings. The cockpit and the front section of the cabin were simply gone, swallowed by the dense, snow-covered forest outside. I crawled toward the rear of our section. Marcus. I found him still strapped into his seat. The heavy oak conference table had been dislodged during the impact, acting like a battering ram. I don't need to describe what it did. I placed 2 trembling fingers against the cold skin of his neck, though I already knew the answer. No pulse. The booming, infectious laugh that had filled the cabin just moments ago was extinguished forever. Bile rose in my throat. I turned away, crawling frantically through the debris. Sarah. David. I found Sarah near the tier in the fuselage. She had been thrown from her seat when the floor beneath her buckled. She lay impossibly still amidst the scattered pages of her structural stress tests. There was no visible injury, just a peaceful, terrifying stillness. She looked as though she had merely fallen asleep while working. I checked for a pulse, my tears finally spilling over, freezing almost instantly on my cheeks. Nothing. No. No, no, no. I scrambled toward the gaping hole where the front of the plane used to be. The wind whipped my hair, driving icy needles of snow into my face. I stepped out of the shredded metal cocoon and into a monochromatic nightmare. We had crashed into the side of a steeply sloped, heavily forested mountain. The right wing was sheared off entirely, 100 yards up the debris trail. The fuselage I had just exited was wedged precariously between 2 massive, ancient pine trees. And there, 50 feet down the snowy incline, lay the crushed remnants of the forward cabin and the cockpit. I slid down the slope, ignoring the burning pain in my arm and the deep ache in my head. The snow was waist deep, slowing my desperate progress. When I reached the forward section, I saw the pilots through the shattered windscreen. They hadn't stood a chance. Then, I saw David. He was in the first row, his seat partially ejected from the torn fuselage. I dragged myself to him, falling to my knees in the snow. His eyes were closed, his face pale, a deep laceration across his forehead. "David, please," I begged, grabbing his shoulder with my good hand, shaking him gently. "Please, get up. You have to get up. You're the one who fixes things." He didn't move. The man who had built an empire, who had believed in me when I was just an arrogant kid with a drafting pencil, was gone. I collapsed backward into the snow, looking up at the indifferent, churning gray sky. I was entirely, fundamentally alone. 4 incredibly bright, vibrant lives had been snuffed out in a fraction of a second, leaving only me, the architect, the guy who designed boxes for people to live in. I had no survival skills. I didn't know how to hunt, how to navigate, how to endure. My chest began to heave. The hyperventilation started as a flutter and rapidly escalated into a full-blown panic attack. The sheer, crushing gravity of the situation was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. The freezing temperature, the failing light, the dead bodies of my friends, the impending night, it was an insurmountable wall of horror. My mind fractured, spiraling toward the abyss of madness. I needed an anchor. I needed geometry. I needed rules. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the horrific tableau of the crash site away. In the blackness of my mind, I drew a grid. 9 vertical lines intersecting 10 horizontal ones. I pictured the familiar wooden board, the scent of lacquer, the perfectly carved circular pieces. A Zionki board. I am the general, I told myself, my breathing ragged but slowing. I am confined to the palace. I cannot retreat, and I cannot flee the board. The cold, the wind, the injuries, they are the chariots and the cannons, crossing the river, bearing down on my position. Panic is a blunder. Despair is a checkmate. I forced my eyes open. The snow was still there. The wreckage was still there. but the chaotic terror had been compartmentalized into a brutal, unforgiving game of strategy. I had to evaluate the board state. I had to calculate my next move. Move 1, secure the pieces. Stop the bleeding. I dragged myself back up the steep incline to the rear section of the fuselage. My left arm was swelling rapidly against the torn fabric of my suit. Inside the cabin, I rummaged through the debris with my right hand until I found the emergency first aid kit mounted near the aft lavatory. I tore it open with my teeth. Using a triangular bandage and a splint fashioned from a rolled-up architectural magazine, I bound my fractured arm tightly to my chest. The pain was nauseating, white flashes going off behind my eyes with every tightening pull, but I clamped my jaw shut and finished the knot. Move 2, fortify the palace. Establish shelter. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, menacing shadows across the snow. The wind was picking up, howling like a hungry wolf. If I stayed exposed, hypothermia would claim me before midnight. I couldn't stay in the rear fuselage, the gaping hole acted as a wind tunnel. I looked around the wreckage. The aft lavatory and the small baggage compartment behind it were relatively intact, forming a small, enclosed metal box. It was morbid, but it was a shield against the wind. I spent the next hour working with agonizing slowness. I scavenged everything I could. I stripped the heavy wool blankets from the emergency supplies. I pulled the heavy, insulated coats off my friends, whispering broken apologies to Marcus and Sarah as I disturbed their final rest. It felt like a violation, a desecration, but the cold was an aggressive opponent, and I needed armor. Move 3, bring light to the board. Fire. Finding a way to make fire became my obsession. Matches and lighters were nowhere to be found in the sterile, non-smoking cabin. As the darkness began to swallow the mountains, I remembered the emergency flashlight I had seen near the cockpit. I made one last, treacherous trip down the snowy slope. I retrieved the heavy, industrial flashlight and a bundle of exposed, copper wiring from the avionics panel. Back in my makeshift shelter in the aft compartment, I gathered torn pieces of the upholstery, paper from our presentation folders, and dry pine needles that had blown into the cabin. I broke the casing of the flashlight, exposing the heavy-duty lithium battery. By crossing the copper wires over the positive and negative terminals, I created a spark. It took 20 minutes of frustrating, shivering effort. My right hand was numb, clumsy. But finally, a spark caught the edge of a shredded blueprint. A tiny, fragile orange flame danced in the darkness. I fed it gently, coaxing it into a steady, smoky fire within an aluminum beverage cart I had tipped on its side to act as a fire pit. The heat was a phantom at first, barely touching my frozen skin, but the light was everything. It pushed back the crushing darkness. I huddled in the small, metallic space, wrapped in 3 coats and 2 blankets, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the curved walls. Outside, the wind screamed, a relentless, terrifying sound that promised death. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the past few hours finally began to ebb, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. My arm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that synchronized with my heartbeat. As I stared into the small flames, the psychological toll of the day crashed over me like a tidal wave. The silence beneath the howling wind was deafening. I looked at the empty spaces in the shadows, half expecting David to step out, pour a scotch, and tell me this was all a terrible simulation. Why me? Sarah was brilliant. Marcus had a wife and a newborn daughter. David was an industry titan, a man who built monuments that would outlast us all. And me? I just drew the pictures. Why was I the one breathing the smoky air? Why was I the one burdened with the memories of their final, terrified moments? Survivor's guilt is a heavy, suffocating blanket. It wraps around your mind and whispers that you are a thief, that you stole the breath that belonged to better people. I buried my face in my good hand and wept. I wept for David, for Sarah, for Marcus. I wept for the sheer, unfair brutality of the universe. I cried until there was nothing left but a dry, hollow ache in my chest. I looked back at the fire. The paper had burned away, it was feeding on the synthetic foam of the seats now, emitting a foul, toxic smoke, but it was warm. I closed my eyes and pictured the board again. The opponent had advanced. The cold was pressing in, the injuries were a constant drain on my resources, and the isolation was a psychological siege. My forces were decimated. I was stripped of my armor, my allies, my defenses. But I was still on the board. The general had not fallen. I opened my eyes and looked at the aluminum wall of my shelter. I picked up a piece of charred metal from the fire pit. With shaking hands, I drew a single, vertical line on the wall. Day 1. I don't know why I'm still here, I whispered to the empty, freezing cabin, my voice barely audible over the wind. But I'm not giving up the palace. Not tonight. I pulled the coats tighter around my bruised ribs, leaned my head back against the cold metal, and prepared for the longest night of my life. 4 jagged, uneven lines were carved into the warped aluminum wall of the aft cabin. I stared at them through eyes swollen and crusted with frozen tears and exhaustion. 4 days. 96 hours of a brutal, unforgiving siege. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation, it had become an entity, a heavy, suffocating predator that had slowly chewed its way through my layers of scavenged clothing, bypassed my skin, and settled deep within my marrow. My violent shivering had stopped sometime during the 3rd night, a terrifying biological milestone that meant my body was finally giving up the fight to generate heat. My left arm was a festering nightmare. Despite my crude attempts to bind it, the fracture had become infected. Red, angry streaks crawled up past my shoulder, and a dull, pulsing fever burned behind my eyes, warping the edges of my reality. The pain was no longer sharp, it was a deep, nauseating throb that synchronized with my slowing, shallow heartbeat. Starvation had hollowed me out. The few packets of salted peanuts and stale crackers I had found in the galley were gone by day 2. Now, there was only the metallic taste of melted snow and the gnawing, acidic emptiness in my stomach. I leaned my head back against the frost-covered metal of my shelter. The fire in the beverage cart had died hours ago. I didn't have the strength to venture out and dig for more wet pine needles or tear away more toxic upholstery. You're calculating the wrong variables, Elias. The voice was clear, measured, and perfectly calm. It came from the shadows near the torn lavatory door. I didn't flinch. I just slowly turned my heavy head. David was sitting there, perched on a ruined piece of luggage. He looked exactly as he had on the flight, impeccably dressed in his navy suit, not a hair out of place, untouched by the violence of the crash. "I'm out of moves, David," I whispered, my voice sounding like crushed glass. It didn't bother me that I was talking to a ghost. The hallucinations had started yesterday. First, it was the sound of Sarah typing on her tablet. Then, it was Marcus's booming laugh echoing down the mountain. Now, it was David, here to audit my final moments. "The board is never entirely empty until the king falls," David replied, his phantom eyes studying me with that familiar, analytical intensity. "You've confined yourself to the palace. You're playing purely defensive. But defense only delays the inevitable if you don't look for an opening." I closed my eyes, visualizing the grid that had kept my mind from fracturing entirely. Zionki. The opponent's pieces, the frost, the infection, the isolation had crossed the river. They had stripped me of my elephants and guards. The general was cornered in the center of the palace, surrounded by chariots of ice and cannons of despair. "There is no opening," I breathed out, a white plume of condensation pluming in the freezing air. "The game is over. Did we teach you to design structures that collapse under the first sign of unexpected load?" David's voice grew firmer, echoing the tone he used when I presented a flawed blueprint. Load-bearing pillars, Elias. You find the bedrock. What is your bedrock? I opened my eyes. He was gone. There was only the empty, freezing metal and the howl of the mountain wind. My bedrock. I forced myself to sit up, a wave of vertigo washing over me. The movement sent a sickening jolt through my infected arm. I cried out, the sound muffled by the roar of the wind outside. I dragged myself to the jagged opening of the fuselage and looked out at the monochromatic wasteland. About 30 yards away, in a small clearing untouched by the initial impact, sat my final, desperate gambit. During the agonizing, lucid hours of day 3, I had painstakingly built a pyre. I had dragged green, sap-heavy pine branches, the kind that would produce thick, black smoke, and piled them over the dry, shattered remnants of the cabin's interior paneling. Beneath it all, I had placed a severed section of a fuel line I had managed to pry loose from the wreckage, still dripping with highly combustible aviation fuel. It was a signal fire designed to be seen for miles. But it was useless unlit, and my makeshift battery sparker was dead. I had one flare left in the emergency kit, a small, handheld maritime flare I had found wedged beneath a seat. I looked at the sky. The perpetual ceiling of bruised, gray clouds that had trapped me here was finally beginning to fracture. Shafts of pale, anemic sunlight were piercing through the overcast, illuminating the jagged peaks in a mocking display of alpine beauty. The storm was breaking. If anyone was looking for us, today was the day they would fly. Thwump. 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 I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. The sound was distant, muffled by the topography of the mountain, but it was not the wind. It was rhythmic. Mechanical. It was the heavy, percussive beating of rotor blades slicing through the thin mountain air. Adrenaline, dormant and depleted, flooded my system in a violent surge. It was a terrifying, burning energy that overrode the fever, the frostbite, and the agonizing pain in my arm. Move, I hissed through chattering teeth. Move. I threw myself out of the fuselage. The snow was thigh-deep, a freezing vice that tried to pull me down. I didn't walk, I crawled. I dragged my broken body through the snowdrifts, using my good right arm and my legs to propel myself forward like a wounded animal. The sound was getting louder. Thwump. 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 I reached the clearing, collapsing at the base of the unlit pyre. I fumbled in my heavy, scavenged coat with numb, clumsy fingers, pulling out the red plastic tube of the emergency flare. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped it in the snow. No, 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 please, I sobbed, frantically digging through the powder to retrieve it. The helicopter was close now. I could hear the whine of its turbines echoing off the canyon walls. It was flying low, conducting a grid search. If they passed over the next ridge, they would miss the wreckage entirely, hidden beneath the canopy of ancient pines. I gripped the flare. I pulled the cap off with my teeth, tasting bitter plastic and salt. I grasped the striker wire. Find the bedrock. Execute the move. I yanked the wire. A blinding, magnesium bright red light erupted from the tube, accompanied by a fierce, hissing roar. Searing heat washed over my frozen face. I didn't hesitate. I thrust the burning flare directly into the center of the pyre, right where the fuel-soaked paneling lay beneath the green boughs. The aviation fuel caught instantly with a muffled whoosh. A wall of orange flame erupted upward, eagerly devouring the dry wood and immediately catching the sap of the green branches. Within seconds, a thick, greasy pillar of pitch-black smoke billowed into the pale sky. I fell backward into the snow, the heat of the fire a sudden, shocking contrast to the days of endless ice. The rhythmic thudding of the rotors changed pitch. It grew deafening. Suddenly, cresting the ridge above the timberline, a massive, orange and white Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter appeared. It hung in the air like an impossible, mechanical angel, its nose pitching down as it spotted the towering column of black smoke. They had found me. The downdraft from the massive rotors hit the clearing like a hurricane, whipping the snow into a blinding whiteout and fanning the signal fire into a roaring inferno. I shielded my face with my good arm, peering through the swirling ice. A side door slid open. I saw the silhouette of a crewman leaning out, looking down. He raised an arm, signaling. I tried to stand, to wave, to shout, but my body had absolutely nothing left to give. The adrenaline crash was instantaneous and catastrophic. My vision tunneled, the edges turning a fuzzy, static gray. I felt myself slipping sideways, the cold snow welcoming me back into its embrace. Through the fading static of my consciousness, I saw a figure in a high-visibility suit descending from the helicopter on a winch line. He hit the snow a few yards from me, unclipped from the cable, and sprinted through the deep powder. He dropped to his knees beside me. For the first time in 96 hours, I felt the warmth of another living human being. Large, gloved hands gripped my shoulders. A face encased in a helmet and visor leaned in close. "I've got you," a voice yelled over the deafening roar of the helicopter. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "You're safe. We've got you." He was assessing my injuries, moving with practiced, urgent efficiency. I felt a heavy harness being slipped beneath my arms and secured across my chest. "My friends," I managed to croak, the words tearing at my dry throat. I weakly pointed a trembling finger toward the scattered wreckage. "David. Sarah. Marcus." The rescue swimmer looked toward the torn fuselage, then back down at me. The visor hid his eyes, but the slight tightening of his jaw told me everything. He knew. They always knew. "We'll take care of them, sir," he shouted gently, gripping my good hand tightly. "Right now, I need to get you up. Hold on." He signaled the chopper. The cable went taut. Gravity, which had been my relentless enemy since the plane began to fall, suddenly reversed. I was pulled upward, leaving the snow, the blood, and the wreckage behind. As we ascended toward the hovering Jayhawk, spinning slowly in the cold air, I looked down one last time. From this vantage point, the violence of the crash was laid bare. The shattered metal, the severed trees, the agonizing trail of destruction. It looked incredibly small against the vast, indifferent majesty of the mountains. I closed my eyes as strong hands pulled me into the warm, vibrating cabin of the helicopter. Blankets were thrown over me. Medical monitors were attached. Voices barked coordinates and vitals. But beneath the noise of the rescue, a profound, heavy silence settled over my soul. The game was over. I had survived the board. But I had left my pieces behind in the snow. Epilogue, The Architecture of Silence. 6 weeks later. The hospital room in downtown Chicago smelled of antiseptic, bleached linen, and the faint, sweet scent of the lilies sitting on my bedside table. The rhythmic, electronic beep of the heart monitor had long since been silenced, replaced by the low, constant hum of the city traffic drifting through the sealed glass window. I sat in a padded armchair, dressed in loose civilian clothes. My left arm was encased in a heavy, carbon fiber cast, suspended in a dark blue sling. The frostbite on my face had healed into shiny, tight pink scars across my cheeks and the bridge of my nose. The physical wounds were knitting themselves back together, dictated by the relentless biology of survival. I looked out the window. From the 14th floor, the city spread out like a massive, living organism of concrete, steel, and glass. In the distance, rising above the skyline, was the skeletal steel framework of a new skyscraper. Not the ether spire. Our project had been put on indefinite hold pending a corporate restructuring following the tragic loss of the firm's core leadership. My firm. My colleagues. My family. A soft knock drew my attention from the glass. Dr. Eris, my attending psychiatrist, stepped into the room. She was a kind woman with perceptive eyes who understood that fixing the bone was only 10% of the job. "You're being discharged today, Elias," she said, pulling up a chair across from me. "How are you feeling about going home?" "It's just an apartment now," I replied softly, my voice still carrying a slight rasp from the smoke inhalation. "But I'm ready to leave this room." She nodded slowly, opening her folder. "We've talked a lot over the past few weeks about the guilt. The survivor's burden. You know that structurally, logically, there was nothing you could have done to change the outcome of that flight. I know the logic, doctor. I know the physics of a catastrophic engine failure at 40,000 feet. I know the human body isn't designed to withstand a deceleration of that magnitude." I looked down at my good hand, tracing the fading scratches on my knuckles. "But logic doesn't sleep in my bed at night. Logic doesn't hear the wind howling through the metal. Healing isn't linear, Elias. You survived a trauma that most people cannot even conceptualize. You have to give yourself permission to carry it, rather than trying to put it down." "I don't want to put it down," I said, looking back out at the city. "If I put it down, they fade. I am the only archive left of their last moments. I am the only one who knows the exact look in David's eyes when the oxygen masks dropped. I'm the only one who knows how peaceful Sarah looked in the snow." I turned to face her, the heavy truth of my survival settling over me like a permanent mantle. Before the crash, I designed buildings to defy gravity. I spent my life trying to conquer space, to build higher, to push back against the sky. I thought we were untouchable. I touched the cold edge of my cast. The mountain taught me otherwise. It taught me about the gravity of silence. About how fragile the glass really is. Dr. Eris closed her folder. "What will you do now, Elias? Will you go back to architecture?" I looked back at the distant steel framework rising into the clouds. "Yes," I said quietly. "But I'm not going to build monuments to ego anymore. David used to tell me to find the bedrock. I know what the bedrock is now. It's not concrete. It's memory." An hour later, I walked out through the automatic sliding doors of the hospital lobby and stepped onto the bustling Chicago pavement. The noise of the city hit me: the sirens, the chatter of pedestrians, the roar of a passing elevated train. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of life carrying on as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. I pulled my coat tight against the chill of the autumn wind. I took a deep breath of the city air. It tasted of exhaust and rain. It didn't taste like aviation fuel or pine. I began to walk down the crowded avenue, just another face in the sea of humanity. To them, I was just a man with a broken arm. They couldn't see the mountain I carried on my back. They couldn't see the ghosts walking quietly beside me. I was the sole survivor. I had won the cruelest game of strategy the universe could devise. But as I walked into the fading afternoon light, I knew that a part of Elias Thorne had died in the freezing wreckage of that Gulf Stream, and the man who walked away was simply the architect of its memory. The city was loud. But inside my head, it would forever remain profoundly, sacredly silent.